Good evening, and welcome to Harvest the Past, Feed the Future. This is a symposium that will be looking at Eastern agricultural complex, indigenous forgotten crops here in Eastern North America. And we have a number of my colleagues here with me tonight. I'm Paul Patton in Food Studies and Department of Sociology and Anthropology, and I am very excited for the presentations that we have this evening. Let me begin by introducing our first speaker, Natalie Mueller. She's a fellow at Washington University of St. Louis in anthropology. Her primary research is in domestication and origins of food production, and she is a historical ecologist, and I welcome her now to the stage.
Hi, everyone. That's okay, I got it. That's what I hit. Oops. There we go. All right. We'll get there. Okay. Okay. So good evening. I'm really happy to be here and have this opportunity to share some of the experiences that I've had cultivating and observing the lost crops of Eastern North America. So since I'm going first, I'm going to introduce you guys to these crops, as most people have never heard of them. The four of us study a group of plants that are referred to as the Eastern Agricultural Complex, and that's the topic of this symposium. So when you all think about Native American agriculture, probably what you imagine are these crops here underneath the column that says Mississippian, right? Maize, beans, and squash that are sort of the archetypal crops that we eat on Thanksgiving and associate with Native Americans. Maybe you also think of some of our native varieties of squash, like acorn squashes and sunflowers, which were actually domesticated right here in Eastern North America, and they've been grown here ever since. But those crops down at the end, squash varieties like pumpkins, beans, and maize, those plants were domesticated in Mexico, and they reached Eastern North America relatively recently. They were developed by local farmers to grow well in the climates that we have here. And we won't really be talking any more about them tonight. So the lost crops of the Eastern Agricultural Complex are these 5 crops up here. And you're going to hear a lot about Iva annua, or Marshelder, Chenopodium, or a relative of quinoa, if you guys have ever eaten that, the Andean crop quinoa. And then the 2 in the middle are grasses. I'm going to talk a little bit about them at the end of my presentation, maygrass and little barley. They're both spring maturing grasses. But the major topic of my research for the past 3 or 4 years has been this neglected lost crop, which is called erect knotweed. So I'm going to go into some detail about that in this presentation. This is the core area where these lost crops were cultivated in prehistory. And we don't really have a good geographical term for this region today. Sometimes I call it the Midwest, and then people get angry at me if they're from, Arkansas. So it includes parts of what are now the South and the Midwest, and Ohio, of course. And it makes sense if you think about it in terms of the rivers. So these are the major northern tributaries of the Mississippi River and the Mississippi River Valley itself. So as I said, I've recently completed a project that was focused on one of these lost crops, erect knotweed, and I just wanted to give you an idea of what my data looks like. So I photograph ancient and modern fruits from erect knotweed plants, and then I use image analysis to quantify their morphology or their shape. So you might be thinking to yourself, those objects appear to be seeds, so why did I just call them fruits? But the reason why is because I'm a real stickler for botanical nomenclature being correct, even when it confuses people. And what these actually are is one-seeded fruits with a hard outer fruit coat or pericarp. So a more familiar crop that shares this type of fruiting body is buckwheat. So if you guys have ever eaten buckwheat, then you've seen an akene or a one-seeded fruit like the ones that erect knotweed has. And in order to digest buckwheat, we have to at least fracture that hard outer pericarp. Sometimes people eat it. It can taste kind of like cardboard. More often, it's just removed, and then the kernel inside or the seed is what we actually eat. Not sure if I wanted to say anything else about that. I don't think so. So why would you want to study the morphology of a seed or a fruit? Well, I think many of you in the audience are either gardeners or farmers, and I'm sure that you're well aware that each of our crop plants has hundreds or in some cases even thousands of distinct varieties. And we call these plant varieties or land races, and they've been carefully selected by farmers to suit local conditions or preferences over many generations. And so in this way, they really embody the knowledge and the traditions of the communities that created them. And so it's my hope that I can give you a little bit of insight into what ancient farmers were doing by going into some detail about the seeds and fruits of this plant, erect knotweed. Another reason why it's interesting to study the morphology of seeds and fruits is because the bodies and behaviors of many plants and animals have been shaped over multiple generations by their interactions with human societies. And we call this process domestication. So I like to use dogs as my example because they're so familiar to so many people. Of course, we all know that from wolves came these many different breeds of dogs that have evolved and been intentionally selected to participate in human societies in various ways. So my dog, she's a black lab. She's really obsessed with hunting birds. My parents' pug, Ben, is more or less just a source of entertainment, I think. Basset hounds are really good at sort of hunting small animals that live in holes in the ground, like rabbits. And shepherds were, of course, selected to protect other domesticated animals from predators and enemies. So it can be kind of harder to see the differences in the morphology of plants, or they're less obvious, but they're equally informative about ancient people's choices and needs. So before I get into what I've discovered about the domestication of this plant, I have to just explain a couple of important facts about this species because most people are not familiar with it. It does have a close relative that grows in the cracks of sidewalks, and now you'll probably notice it when spring hits. But I like to just give you a little intro in case you've never noticed this little plant before. So erect knotweed is an annual herbaceous plant, and it produces seeds all summer from May to November. But it's very likely that ancient farmers went out and collected its seeds during this period of simultaneous fruiting that occurs just before the plant dies, and that's usually in late October or early November, depending on the weather. This year, because it was so warm, it didn't happen until December. But you can see that at this time of year, the fruits are much more abundant. They're also a lot easier to remove from the plant. You can just kind of hand strip them off into a basket or a bag. If you go out in the summer and try to harvest seeds, you have to like pick them off with tweezers, which is not a particularly efficient way to harvest seeds. The second important fact that you need to know, I'm going to be talking for the next 5 minutes or so about these morphs, tubercled morphs and smooth morphs. So erect knotweed and its relatives have what are called dimorphic achenes, so more botany words. That means that they produce two different types of fruits on the same plant. So the production of these different types of achenes is seasonal. During the summer, they produce only tubercled morphs, and then beginning in the middle of September, they start to also produce these smooth morphs, so that at the end of the season, you have a variety in the composition of the harvest, some percentage of smooth and some percentage of tubercled. And so this is the data that I collected over the course of a couple of growing seasons. And you can see that there are more smooth morphs the later you go out in the season. Roughly speaking, there's a lot of variability, but you never get 100% of the harvest being these smooth morphs. So the characteristics of domesticated erect knotweed, which I've recently described, this publication just came out like a day ago, so I'm pretty excited about it. It's a newly named subspecies that was domesticated, and it differs from the wild erect knotweed that I've just described to you in two ways. So first of all, those tubercled morphs are missing from the domesticated assemblages. They are no longer produced by the plant. And second, the fruits become much larger, which is something that's really typical of annual plants that we cultivate for their seeds around the world. So let's start with that larger fruit size. What I've done in this image is I have two of my archaeological specimens. They come from two different sites, one of which is in Arkansas and the other of which is in Illinois. And I have a typical modern fruit laid over top of it. So you can see the difference that occurred in the size under human selection. So why would this occur for all of these plants? Most of our domesticated seed crops have larger seeds or fruits than their wild ancestors. And there's a lot of different reasons why it might occur, but one of them is that all other things being equal, a larger seed contains more nutritive material, which means that it's going to grow faster than a smaller seed. So you can think of the endosperm or the perisperm of the seed basically as lunch. that the mother plant has packed for her offspring. So of course, if she packs a bigger lunch, then her babies will be able to grow faster. And this is the only source of energy that plants have until they start photosynthesizing for themselves. So that becomes relevant in the context of cultivation because, again, as many of you know, if you've interacted with plants, one very common thing that farmers and gardeners will do is plant more seeds than they actually want there to be full-grown plants. And then once all the seedlings have emerged, you can go through and pick out the weaker-looking seedlings, leaving the most robust ones to actually grow to maturity and reproduce themselves. And then you get tasty sprouts to, put on your salad at the same time. And so what this does over the course of many generations is it provides a selective advantage to seedlings that grow faster, so that they're the ones that get left behind by the farmer to actually reproduce themselves. And it selects for larger seeds. One of the really interesting things that I found in my greenhouse experiments, which I conducted 2 years ago now, wow, time flies, was that farmers would have had a really good reason or incentive to thin out plants, even if they didn't realize or they didn't know that they were selecting for larger seeds. And that's because less plants, basically counterintuitively, less plants growing in the same amount of space produce more seeds by weight. So this is just one really extreme example where I have 20 plants growing in one tray and one plant growing in another tray of the exact same size, and the one plant produced more than twice as much seed by weight. This happens in many plants. Again, if plants have a lot of room to grow, they get a lot of nutrients, they get a lot of water, then they can produce a lot of seeds. But it's really pronounced in erect knotweed because it produces seeds in the axils of its branches. So if it branches out more, then it produces a lot more seeds. So I think that probably initially what people were doing was they were thinning out wild stands of erect knotweed so that they would be more productive. And over the course of hundreds or thousands of years, this led to the development of a landrace or a domesticated variety that has larger seeds. The second characteristic of domesticated erect knotweed is a little bit more unique to this species, and I think it's really interesting. Because this species has these two different types of fruits naturally, and what basically happened under domestication is that one of these fruit types disappeared. So those tubercle morphs went away. Now you can see here these cross sections of the pericarp, or the fruit coat of the seed. And the tubercle morphs have much thicker fruit coats. And they're also fortified with layers of wax, which prevents moisture and pathogens from reaching the seed. So what the fruit coat is doing is it's controlling the timing of germination. It's mechanically restricting the seed. And when certain conditions are met and the seed coat has been broken down enough, the fruit coat has been broken down enough, the seed will be able to germinate. So these two different types of seeds have really different behaviors when it comes to germinating. So if any of you have ever tried to cultivate wild plants, you're interested in prairie plants or something like that, then you might realize that wild plants are usually not going to just grow if you harvest them from the plant and then put them right back into the soil. Plants that grow in temperate regions usually needs to experience some part of winter conditions in order to germinate. So they either need to be exposed to cold or moisture or some amount of time or some combination of these factors. So what I did in these germination experiments a couple years ago was I tried to just plant them, and none of them germinated. And so then I simulated winter for 6 weeks, which sounds a lot fancier than it actually is, because what I did was I put them in bags of mud and then I put them into a refrigerator. And after that, what I was able to see was this really clear what's called a germination heteromorphism, or a difference between these two types of fruits in terms of their germination behavior. So these are two different experiments in 2 different years, but you can see the same trend in both, which is that those smooth morphs, generally speaking, they germinate at really high rates. Sometimes you even get 100% germination after you've simulated winter. And the tubercle morphs, they're not ready to germinate after that amount of time. Another really interesting thing that I found in these experiments is that not only do those smooth morphs germinate more reliably, which is important for farmers, obviously, but they also grow faster. So you can see here, after the same amount of time, those taller plants on the one half of the tray, those are all the seedlings from the smooth morphs. They're bigger, right? Which becomes important. So this graph is showing you 2 different measures of plant size, basically the number of leaves and the height of the plant. And you can see that throughout the first 5 weeks of their lives, on average, the smooth morph seedlings are bigger. And that's important, again, because of this process of thinning. So if we get our cultivator, they were women in Eastern North America in prehistory, so that's why we've got a little woman meme here. She comes in 2 weeks after she has sown the seeds. She's going to find that the smooth morph seedlings are bigger. Those are going to be the ones that get left behind to reproduce themselves. And the same thing is true no matter when she comes. through the plot to thin out the seedlings. And so again, over time, what this does is it provides a selective advantage to plants that are producing more smooth morphs and less tubercled morphs. And it may have taken a long time for this to actually result in a domesticated landrace, but by the Mississippian era, approximately 800 years ago, we have this very different type of plant. It's completely changed its reproductive strategy in response to what humans are doing, which is really interesting. And there's another part of this that I really, really like. What erect knotweed does in the wild is something called evolutionary bet-hedging. And what that means is that, okay, so if those smooth morph seedlings, they germinate more reliably and they grow faster, then the obvious question is, why would a plant produce any tubercled morphs in the first place, right? Like, they don't germinate, they're just sitting there, and then they produce these weakling seedlings. They don't seem like a very well-adapted type of strategy for a plant. But the answer to this question is kind of one of my favorite pieces of the puzzle, because it gives us such a cool insight into how the ecosystems that were created by farmers really provided a unique opportunity for annual plants. So this is one of the populations that I studied. I first found this population in the fall of 2014, and I collected seeds there. There were thousands of plants. And when I came back in May, as expected, there were baby erect knotweed plants growing where their parents had grown the year before. But over the summer, there were these catastrophic floods in the Illinois River Valley where this population is located. And the creek bank was scoured before the plants had a chance to reproduce themselves, so when they were still young plants that hadn't produced any seeds yet. So when I came back in October with my glum-looking research assistant here, there were no plants. There were no plants at all to harvest. They had been completely wiped out. So it's really this kind of environmental unpredictability that makes those tubercled morphs so important to erect knotweed survival without human protection. Because this summer, that same stand of erect knotweed was back on that creek bank, even though the population didn't produce any seeds in 2015. And the reason why is because those tubercled morphs that don't germinate were sitting in the seed bank. They were ready to regenerate when conditions improved. So ecologists and evolutionary biologists who study plants have theorized that dormancy is basically a means of escaping in time. So plants are able to sample the same location during different growing seasons. But an alternative strategy is to evolve an elaborate means of dispersal. And so a famous example of this are dandelions, right? Their seeds go flying all over the place. They can land miles away from where their parent lived. So erect knotweed didn't evolve wings like dandelions have, but it did actually acquire a new mode of dispersal, at least for about 2,500 years, which was human farmers. So we've already seen how cultivators may have selected for plants that produce a lot of smooth morphs and plants that produce larger seeds by thinning out stands, but I think that they were also relaxing some of the selective pressures that were at work on wild erect knotweed. And they probably did that in a couple of ways. They were providing a more stable environment, for one thing. So erect knotweed in the wild, it only grows in highly disturbed environments, because in environments that aren't disturbed very frequently, other plants are quickly able to succeed, shrubs and trees and things like that. So plants like erect knotweed don't really get a chance to live in stable environments. But humans were creating clearings above the floodplains in places that would otherwise be inaccessible to these floodplain weeds that you'll hear more about from a couple of the other speakers. And so they're providing a stable environment where this bet hedging is no longer necessary for survival. Another thing that they were doing is saving seeds, and we know that. You'll hear a lot more about that from Liz, because we find caches of seeds in baskets and in bags in caves and rock shelters in eastern Ohio and Kentucky and Tennessee, and also in the Ozarks Mountains on the other far western end of this core area. So we know that people are saving seeds, and that makes a big difference for plants because they don't have to rely on the seeds that are in the seed bank. If a population is wiped out by a flood or some other bad event, human farmers can replenish that population from their seed stock. So it really changes the selective pressures that are acting on plants when they're protected by people. So I'm continuing to kind of explore how erect knotweed responds to different types of cultivation techniques. This year I grew it outside for the first time, not in the greenhouse. And I'm interested in what effects sun and shade have on the production of seeds and on how productive the plants are on absolute yields. And I'm also studying the effects of plant spacing. So an interesting thing to note about these plants is each of these is an individual plant. So when you grow this plant in a garden, it basically transforms from being this little herb to becoming a woody shrub, a small shrub, which is really interesting. This plant has a potential, without any human selection or any domestication, but just over the course of one generation, to produce way, way more seed than it would in its natural environment. And that's a theme I think that you'll be hearing more about from Paul and perhaps from the other speakers as well. So after learning so much about erect knotweed from interacting with living plants, I really wanted to find populations of the other lost crops that I've described to you and also study their habitats and start growing them. So last spring, I initiated this project called the Survey for Lost Crops, which I'll be going out and doing again this spring and fall. And with the help of these colleagues, one of whom is here right now, Liz, I was able to find populations of those two grasses, little barley and maygrass. Little barley's all over the place. Probably some of you are aware of it because it's kind of an obnoxious weed. But maygrass is actually pretty rare. And so in the course of doing this survey and also in the course of my work with erect knotweed, I've realized that at least two of these lost crops are actually not doing very well in 21st century America. And I think there's a couple of reasons that are particular reasons for each of these species that I'll go into a little bit. So erect knotweed's habitat is, it's very rare. It shouldn't be, but it is. It's very rare. It took me 3 years to find a population of this plant, and even now I've only documented 6 populations, and I've been looking for it for going on, 6 years now. So it grows exclusively in disturbed habitats, and it's usually found in close proximity to water. But it used to be really common in towns and cities. Like if you go to an herbarium and you look at records from the 1900s, you'll see it was in like playgrounds and fairgrounds and different things like that, but it doesn't occur in those places anymore. Now it's only found in really out-of-the-way type places like farmyards, boat launches, and sometimes in the cut banks of like dirt roads way out in the country. And I think the reason why we don't find it in cities and towns anymore is because of competition with European relative weeds. So it's kind of hard to spot the differences between these two species. It's not for me anymore, but it once was very difficult for me to tell the difference between these two species. But the one with the sort of skinnier leaves on this side is the European introduced one. And that's the one where if it was springtime, we could go out on the sidewalk right now and find it. It would be the first plant that you would see growing in the sidewalk. It's absolutely ubiquitous. And I think it's better at competing in the kinds of disturbed environments that we're creating today because it creeps along the ground. It's called prostrate knotweed. And so if you mow it or trample on it, it does better than upright erect plant. So I basically think that erect knotweed is being outcompeted by its cousin. Maygrass is kind of a different story. It can be found still in protected prairies. We found that in a few of the different protected prairie fragments that still exist in Arkansas and Missouri. But it was also once very common to find it growing in dense homogeneous stands like this one that you see in the picture, which is on the margin of an agricultural field. And many of these populations have been destroyed very recently. So we were really lucky to find this one in southeast Arkansas last spring, but my advisor took me to the locations where she'd collected maygrass 20 years ago, and those populations are, they're gone. And I think that the reason for that is probably because of the increased herbicide use that's gone along with the use of genetically modified crops that are really tolerant to herbicides. So whereas farmers used to have to kind of be careful where they were spraying herbicides because it would hurt their crops too, now they're able to just kind of spray it in a blanket. And so you can see the sort of like piles of dead plants along the sides of the agricultural fields that have been killed by this kind of indiscriminate use of herbicides. So obviously these two plants require kind of different conservation strategies, but I think that they're very important plants, and they're really in danger of extinction, so we need to conserve them. And not just these crops, but also traditional land races and other ethnobotanically important native plants. So that means creating seed banks, I think. Seed banks are a really important way to make sure that people who do want to grow these plants have access to the seed, that it's viable, that it's correctly identified. And they can also be a good place to promote what's called in situ conservation, or growing things out in their natural habitat, while also providing a backup in case those outdoor ecosystems fail for one reason or another. So I'm hoping that we can get something like that off the ground. We've been talking a lot about it. And there's really good examples of similar things from other parts of the United States, like Native Seed Search in Tucson, Arizona, which is a great storehouse for these local land races that do well in the desert there. So I'm going to leave it on sort of a positive note. Just thank you guys. Thank everybody who's participated in this project over the years, and also Paul for inviting me here. And I'll turn it over to him to introduce the next speaker.
And there will be an opportunity to ask plenty of questions at the end. We'll have all all the speakers come up. So if you're interested in asking Natalie some questions about some of the research she was discussing, you'll have that chance then. Next, I want to introduce Andrew Weiland. Andrew received his BA from here at Ohio University and is currently working on his dissertation at Ohio State. And again, his research is in primarily now looking at late woodland and late prehistoric populations and food production in the Ohio Valley region, but he's worked extensively on middle woodland, hopewell assemblages, and others, so, and particularly Marshelder, which he's going to be speaking with us tonight. So welcome, Andrew.
Thanks, Paul. All right, thank you for having me this evening. I am a Bobcat turned Buckeye. I don't know what that means, but so I'm going to be discussing. I did my research for my master's degree on Marshelder, Iva annua, and tonight I'm just talking about some other theoretical directions you can take with Marshelder. Explicitly, its use as a rare source of fat in native North America. So when you guys think of fat, you think of something bad, right? You think of something you should not be eating. But more and more today, people are realizing that small amounts of good lipids can increase the amount of micronutrients that you can absorb, and are really essential. Native North Americans wouldn't have had any choice between good or bad fats. They just would have had a very scarce set of sources for finding foods that were high in fat. And well, when I say this, some of you might say, well, what about all the meats that people were eating? When you think about a stereotypical Native American diet, you're probably imagining lots of venison, you're probably imagining some buffalo, whatever you're imagining, it's not going to be high in fat. Most of these meats, and those of you who've hunted are familiar with the fact that we don't have high amounts of fat in wild game. So if you just take a cursory look at some of these wild game species and their fat content versus some of these domesticates, it's immediately apparent that even in something such as chicken that we think of as being pretty low fat, doesn't stack up to venison, right, or something like that. So one of the good sources, and I guess I should describe what rabbit starvation is since I have that tantalizingly up at the top of the slide. So many early explorers in North America discovered this, and when you're looking for food, an easy thing to snare is a brace of hares, right? That you're going to be, and many explorers would eat large amounts of rabbit and get what's known as protein poisoning or rabbit starvation. So you're getting plenty of protein, but you're not getting any sorts of fats, and you're unable to absorb many of the nutrients that you should be able to absorb, and people would starve. But what about the generations upon generations of people who grew up in North America? These people who were well adapted culturally to their habitats did not have this problem of rabbit starvation or protein poisoning, but they had many sources to look to, and one of the major ones that we see throughout the archaeobotanical record is that of nuts. There's plenty of hickory and walnut, and if you look at the fat content of these, it's much higher than any of the wild game that you would find. And then we also have a number of different seeds that would have been available, including many of the members of the Eastern Agricultural Complex that Natalie just introduced, and I'll talk about them briefly in a moment. But the problem with nuts is that you're going to have a very high quality, high caloric content that can be very variable. So people know that trees are going to produce nuts year after year, but they don't necessarily know, well, not every year is a good massed yield for a nut tree. And sometimes this has to do with climate, but some people think that this may have to do with an evolutionary strategy on the part of trees to keep from being overpredated by specialists. So keeping certain animals from evolving to specialize on a certain type of nut. So therefore, some people have posited, including this very recent publication by Ziana and also Paul Gardner in 1997, talk about the fact that some of these EAC crops there may have been some impetus to have grown those as a buffer against shortages in nuts, and to stabilize some of these unstable mass yields. Ziana, in his work, talks about using chenopodium, which Paul's going to talk about tonight, uses chenopodium as his example of a buffer, although I think, as I'll talk about tonight, Marshelder or sunflower may have made better sorts of buffers because they're more comparable to seeds, as they are oily crops. So Natalie already introduced the Eastern Agricultural Complex, but I will also say that the Eastern Agricultural Complex is neither Eastern nor necessarily agricultural, nor a complex. It's some of these members are not just found in what's now the U.S. East. Little barley, for example, is found in the southwest of what's now the U.S. And these are agricultural, but not in terms of the type of monoculture you think about when you think about maize or some sort of modern industrial crop. And then in terms of being a complex, these are usually, when you think of a complex, you think of a package that moves in. So say chickens and pigs in Polynesia, or a whole set of crops moving from in Neolithic Near East into Europe, for example. But these sort of occur in dribs and drabs in various circumstances and various combinations, depending on the site and the era that you're looking at. So most of your Eastern Agricultural Complex crops are starchy and high in carbohydrates. But there are a couple of members that are high in oil, and they're pretty closely related. Sunflower and Marshelder, which are both Asteraceae and both in the tribe Helianthiae. And you can see here how Marshelder stacks up with the rest of the available nutrients that you would have in some of these things that would be common in prehistoric native North America. I have quinoa here as a stand-in nutritionally for what would have been domesticated chenopodium. And sunflower is also the modern domesticate, which is much larger and oilier. Actually, Marshelder would have had more oil, more fat content than sunflower in prehistory, judging by the size and its contents. But you can see that in terms of total lipids, Marshelder and sunflower were good contestants compared to something like hickory or walnut. For my master's thesis, just as sort of a side note to this general theme I'm talking about in terms of nutrition, I thought I would add a little bit about the domestication of Marshelder. For my master's thesis, I looked at the seed lengths and widths of Marshelder throughout various archaeological sites throughout various regions, and sort of compiled them together to get an idea of some of the patterns of domestication. Marshelder's signs of domestication aren't quite so complex as that of erect knotweed that Natalie just described. Basically what you're seeing in terms of signs of domestication in Marshelder are an increase in size of the achenes. And you see it rise pretty drastically. So you start off at around 2 to 3 millimeters in the wild size and surpass 8 millimeters in some circumstances. These are the means of all these sites that are represented here in various eras. And Dick Yarnell in the 1970s showed this drastic difference in size of site means with a sort of a line going straight up. But what my master's thesis describes is sort of a regional variation in the trajectories of these things. And one of those differences is the fact that some regions did not see a wild form of Marshelder. Some regions saw Marshelder introduced in its domesticated form. And that's certainly true in eastern Kentucky, where there are many archaeological rock shelter sites. And that's true also in Mammoth and Salt's Caves. Another thing that came out, so this is showing the relative frequency of certain size ranges. And over here on the right, we have the different sites. And then these are all organized according to, by color according to region. Something else that came out during this research was the fact that you see sort of a cline between the western Tennessee sites and the eastern Kentucky sites, in that they cluster together, both visually here and statistically, cluster together according to region, but then have some overlap with nearby regions. My advisor, Chris Gremian, has done a number of processing experiments on Iva annua, on Marshelder, to try to estimate the amount of energy that people were putting in and getting out of these crops. And she did this by doing just very basic processing experiments in a lab. And this can be really important for understanding why people would have domesticated these things in the first place, why we are finding certain amounts of them in certain sites, and understanding more about these crops in the past. But something that she has noted, and that I've noted in some rudimentary experiments, is that there's a film of oil that forms at the top after you cook Iva annua. And a similar film of oil will form when you're cooking hickory. And the way that people cooked hickory in prehistory was to just basically smash the nuts, and so that they didn't have to, if you've ever tried to crack open a hickory and pick out all the little pieces, it's really difficult. So basically you would smash the nuts roughly with a stone, then throw them into a pot, either with a stew that you're making or into some boiling water, and skim some of the oil off of the top for what's known as hickory milk or hickory oil. So basically, this could have been done with Iva annua as well. So not only does it substitute nutritionally, but it may have been a substitute in terms of the way that people were using it culinarily. So future directions that you could take with this knowledge that we have of the nutrients present in many Eastern agricultural crops and understanding human biology, we can incorporate this understanding that the need for body fat and the need for fat inputs into the diet in terms of reproductive maintenance. This is really important for fecundity and can really increase the total fertility rate in a given population. So you might be able to better estimate demographic patterns in prehistory by using optimal foraging theory and seeing what plants were available and seeing what people were using nutritionally, and then also investigate Marshelder as a potential source of protein and oil superfood. It's very high in many micronutrients that I did not incorporate into some of these slides here, but it's a very nutritious crop, and although it's pretty noxious to grow, as Liz has pointed out, and it's also fairly bitter to taste, it still has, if somebody could figure out something to do with it culinarily, it would be a great superfood to add to to add to our diets. So I want to thank everybody who was involved at OU for inviting me down, Paul, Patton, the other speakers, my advisor for talking to me about some of these ideas, and I'd like to also thank Anna and Teresa for being great hosts, and Ohio University in general. So thank you very much.
Give me a second to try to... Oh, wait, wrong one. I really don't like Macs. Let's see. Ah, there we go. Maybe. Hey, Anna, how do you get this thing to work? There we go. Maybe. How do I... Ah, okay, there we go. All right. Yeah, I don't use these Apple-y computers. So next I want to speak a little bit about Chenopodium berlandieri, and this is a crop that I have been working on for a very long time, and it actually has a very long history here in southeastern Ohio. During the centennial year celebration of the founding of the United States, geologist Ebenezer Baldwin Andrews, this wonderful looking gentleman up here, excavated a cache of seeds that we estimate to be about 9.6 million of these things from Ash Cave. How many people have been up into the Hocking Hills and enjoyed Ash Cave? How many people have known it was a really important archaeological site? Yeah. 9.6 million seeds were located along the back of this particular rock shelter, and they were sent to Harvard University, where a botanist, Asa Gray, actually misidentified them as Chenopodium album. And this is an ongoing problem that we have between these two species of plants, as I know so many folks that today continue to identify many of our berlandieri species as album. And it was an issue in the past, but after this misidentification, they were placed in a jar on a shelf in the Peabody Museum with a bunch of other archaeological materials from this site, and they sat there for over 100 years. No one acknowledging that they existed. And a colleague of ours, Bruce Smith, found them sitting on the shelf one day and opened up the jar and took a look at them and began counting these seeds, looking at them under a scanning electron microscope. And what Smith found was that these seeds in actuality were very different from what we see of wild Chenopodium berlandieri seeds. That is to say, there were morphological characteristics, as Natalie has mentioned, that were distinct. And that is that when we look at the general shape of them, they tend to be a little boxier in shape. They kind of look, from a profile view, almost like little hamburgers in a way. But they also, the coat, the exterior coat of these seeds had thinned out, again, making room for quicker germination and more nutrition to allow for that quicker germination, but also reducing the dormancy of these seeds. That is to say that as Natalie was speaking about dormancy, we see the same kind of phenomenon here. We see two varieties, really, now that we recognize since Andrews' discovery, since some of Smith's work and other colleagues. We now can confirm that this was a really important food source. It was a prehistoric crop here in eastern North America. And the two domesticated types that we recognize now, that are probably better understood as different land races of the same species, they've been identified as in a domesticated form as early as 3,800 years ago now. And those specimens come from the Riverton site in southern Illinois. And we distinguish them on the basis of these morphological characteristics. At the top, you can see one of these land races. This is what we often refer to as a black or thin-tested Chenopodium berlandieri subspecies jonesianum. At the bottom, we don't have a nice subspecies name for this. They simply often refer to it as the naked variety in the literature because it looks like it doesn't have a seed coat and it's got that nice tan look to it there, but the testes in these are so very thin, they're almost paper thin. And these probably, the bottom ones look a lot like quinoa that you would buy at Kroger, I would imagine. And so this particular variety, which we'll talk about that in just a moment, the relationship of this particular plant to quinoa. There it is in its glory, growing with a number of little fruits forming there at the top of the plant. We've been documenting this here in southeastern Ohio extensively outside of Ash Cave. These specimens here, it's hard to see a little bit, but this is actually a big cluster of these quinopods from a storage pit where they combusted while they were sitting inside of it. There's actually, you can see these projectile points here, or preformed points. We were excavating. These came out this summer. We excavated these from a large storage pit up on top of a ridge where the Archaeological Field School was excavating. Underneath, and we didn't know it at the time, we removed a lot of sediment from underneath the storage pit. So you had these nice big bladelets inside of a broken prehistoric pot, and underneath the pot were clusters and clusters of stored quinopods, and the measurements we take off of these indicate that they were in fact a domesticated variety. They date to about 1800 years before present. Okay, so this would have been a middle woodland period. Those of you that are familiar with the Hopewell culture, this would have been the same temporal period as that particular population that were building the large earthen mounds throughout southeastern Ohio. What's interesting is we found it on a ridgetop, and that there's a bunch of stored seeds up there, as Natalie was mentioning, not all that different from stored seeds that were found in Ash Cave, and tools that would have been used actually in the planting and processing potentially of these plants. And so pretty certain that what we're seeing here is not just people growing these plants down in floodplains, but actually also growing them up on the ridge tops, probably clearing off some of the area on the ridges and expanding the locations of their agricultural fields. What's really cool about this particular plant and the continuous relationship that I seem to keep having with it. A few years earlier, we had excavated a site not very far from that ridgetop site I was just talking about. And we found just a handful of quinopod seeds at the Mundy Creek Workshop site. And the dates from this site were really, really conclusive. They were all coming back further than, much older than we anticipated when we began digging the site. 4,800 years ago, all the way back further than 5,000 years ago. But we did have quinopods that came out of some of the hearths from that. And those dates were really old, and we thought, okay, well, maybe these are wild, but the measurements on them actually are indicative of a domesticated variety. Unfortunately, the assemblage that we have is so small, we tried to direct date them, we were not able to do that. But we may potentially have, in a sense, some of the earliest evidence of domesticated quinopods from right here in the Hocking Valley. 1,000 years older than what they were supposed to, or the current oldest dates that we have, which is kind of an interesting phenomenon, particularly given this plant, that this may, in fact, this lost crop may have may have originated as a crop here in Appalachian, Ohio, or that it spread very quickly from somewhere else, perhaps the Mississippi Valley, and we'll have all kinds of arguments about this later, I'm sure. But that's what makes this fun, right? So this potential Appalachian food in prehistory, I think, offers, one of the arguments I've been making is that it offers us opportunity to rethink our own food system here in southeastern Ohio. This is quinoa, right? It's very closely related. There was an article that was released this past week that actually argues that if you look at the genetics of Chenopodium quinoa and Chenopodium berlandieri, that they're arguing now that perhaps quinoa is derived from the spread of Chenopodium berlandieri, our species, down into the Andes, and that quinoa was then domesticated from that. It's a really interesting article. You have to check it out if you haven't already. It's full of all kinds of genetics terms that make us all go insane. But if we think about quinoa in terms of economic potential and revenue generation, we can see here these are just a few charts that look at U.S. imports on the bottom here in quinoa running up through 2013. we're talking 70 million pounds per year in 2013, and of course that number has just been increasing since the early 2000s. If we start looking at price in US dollars per kilogram, more recently we rarely see quinoa sales dropping below $4 per kilogram, US dollars that is. So this is a marketable crop, and the demand for it continues to just increase and climb. I try to juxtapose this to where we are in our own sense of place, right, of southeastern Ohio. This is a map that indicates the percentage of people in each of these counties that live in poverty currently. If you look at Athens County there, 31.7% of the county is in poverty based upon these recent statistics. Benton, Meigs, Morgan, this Appalachian region, not much better, right? Even if we go to some of the more border Appalachian counties like Hocking County, we're still looking at 15.9%. And also, if you ever drive around through southeastern Ohio, you'll see a lot of beautiful landscapes like this, right? Empty farmsteads where food could be produced, but currently is not under production. Or as I often see where farms are producing cornfields and so forth, they're spraying a whole lot of herbicides on these fields to get rid of one friend in particular of mine, Chenopodium berlandieri. What's interesting is when we start actually looking at production numbers, looking at the sales of quinoa, and start thinking about Chenopodium berlandieri, our own native variety of this plant, it does give us reason to pause. This was a study that was conducted in the late 1980s, arguing that berlandieri's production, its harvest yield, was comparable and in some cases outweighed organically grown quinoa. The study suggested that it was pretty comparable to what we would expect of organically grown maize. No one had really come back to this to see the legitimacy of these numbers, and there's certainly a lot of question with them until here at OU we decided a couple years ago, let's just try and see what happens, right? Working through food studies with Bayou, Art Tracy was a great help with this. We were able to put in some small plots down at the OU experimental gardens, plant biology experimental gardens, and we were able to harvest those, and based upon those harvests, we were able to extrapolate on what we would expect harvest yields to be in acres, essentially. So just some more beautiful pictures of these plants at harvest time. And so there's some undergraduate students in some of these images helping harvest. This stand is actually another one that we put in at the Wayne National Forest headquarters. They had a special area there they wanted us to put in. We're going back this summer, hopefully with interpretive signs. We had a lot of tribal leaders last summer visit our plot out there while we were trying to get it planted, and they were very excited about the potential of this as a crop that their ancestors once grew living in this region, and what is the potential of that as food for us here today. So the results that we came up with is we extrapolated out from a 24 square meter plot. From that we got 3.1 kilograms of clean seed. That produces approximately, we're talking about 1,152 pounds per acre, compared to organically grown quinoa using the same methods that come in at about 950 pounds per acre. Now I want you to think about this for a moment in cost. If we go with that $4, right, that $4 per kilogram that quinoa is selling for today, usually at its lowest, we're talking about per acre of production somewhere around $2,090, right, per acre of food that would be produced for sale on the market. Compared to 2016's crop budget numbers, said that for the gross for an acre of corn, we're talking $736, okay? It's a big difference. This actually has, I think, economic potential for the region. And so this year we actually have a couple acres, about couple half-acre plots throughout southeastern Ohio that we're going to be running more of these experiments, looking at more of these numbers. So that actually places us somewhere there in terms of harvest yield, right where these studies that were conducted in the 1980s suggested that we would be. Just for a moment, I want to point out some of the nutritional values of this crop in particular as well. Native Americans grew it for a good reason, and that is that it's really high in protein. I have down here highlighted the protein content of quinoa, which comes in at about 12.5. I believe this is in percent dry basis, compared to the 19% that we get out of the Berlandia area, our native variety. So our native variety, again, producing more protein than quinoa, the supposed Andean superfood for protein. And those horrible carbohydrates that we're all trying to avoid, right? Look here, quinoa coming in with 72% compared to our native variety at 47 per dry basis. So nutritionally, even healthier for us. We can start to talk in terms of social justice issues. We can start to talk in terms of economic issues and also our obligations towards a healthier planet and a better environment. You're polluting a whole lot less when you're growing here at home, right? Why not? We all talk a lot about growing local foods. I think we can go even further, and we can talk a little bit about not just growing locally and consuming locally grown foods, but also native foods. And that's where I will leave my conversation of quinoa for the moment. And I will introduce our next speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Horton, who got her PhD from Washington University in St. Louis in 2010. She is a station archaeologist for Arkansas Archaeological Survey for the Toltec Mounds Research Station, and her primary research, as she describes it, is paleoethnobotany of technology. So I will welcome her to the stage.
See if I can get the technology to work. There's a lot of pending updates and okay, there we go. All right. No, I don't need the internet right now. There we go. So very quickly, I just want to talk a little bit about where I'm at, and what I'm going to be talking about this evening is mostly a big sort of public archaeology and research program that I started in 2015. So I'm with the Arkansas Archaeological Survey. I'm stationed at the Toltec Mounds Research Station, which is just outside of Little Rock, Arkansas. And late in 2014, I, in collaboration with my state park where I'm located at, got a $10,000 Arkansas Humanities Council and National Endowment for the Humanities grant to build a public interpretive landscape, an interpretive garden there at the state park. There were a couple of reasons why I wanted to do this. So as a paleoethnobotanist, when I got hired and I started working at that research station, our very good park interpreters had created a little tiny, it was cute, little tiny, what we call a Three Sisters garden, right outside the doorway to the visitor center there at the state park. Unfortunately, our site is a woodland site, dated from AD 700 to AD 1050, at which point none of these people were growing corn or beans, but they were growing the squash. So we decided to go ahead and build what is, I'm fairly sure, the first fully permanent interpretive woodland period garden. So this garden encompasses what people would have been growing and consuming and using in other ways from that time period of AD 700 to AD 1050. As a public garden, as an interpretive garden, one of the things that we definitely needed to do was to develop the interpretive panels. So there are 4 permanent panels out there in the garden, and I'm very proud of these. Suffice to say, PhD academics are not so great at doing museum exhibits. So I worked very hard with my park interpreter colleagues, and I think we came up with some really good interpretive panels, but those are the PDFs of what our panels look like out in our garden. And so I want to just sort of, I'm not going to talk a whole lot more about sort of the public aspect of this garden, but I do want to point out going forward to keep in mind that this actually is a public outreach and a public education garden. We use it for interpretive programs. It's producing materials that park interpreters are using in programs, bottle gourds and some fiber plants, as well as if we can figure out how to cook the iva at some point, we'll be using some of the the food plants as well. So to give you an idea of what this garden is, in terms of being a late woodland garden, we have the whole suite of these EAC crops that my colleagues have just been talking about. We have the sumpweed or the Marshelder, the goosefoot, the chenopodium. We're growing a wild native Curcubita pepo. That's the Curcubita pepo variety Ozarkana. We think genetically this might be the progenitor species for later domesticated pepo squashes, like the acorn squash. We're also growing sunflowers, and we were growing a erect knotweed, and we lost it in a horrible, catastrophic flood. So hopefully we'll have it again this year. We also have the little barley and the maygrass. But in addition to those plants, we also have a whole series of what are sort of real critical economic fruits, things like the stone fruits. So we have our mascot. We have a plum tree in our Plum Bayou garden. We also have some of the blueberries that are native to the area, elderberry, and maypop, which I don't ever want to think about ever again, because they're really overproducing. Elderberry, as well as a kind of a famous southern grape, the muscadine grape, the Vitis rotunifolia. In addition to those, we also have some of our technologically important plants, and this is kind of where I really come in. I can actually come at foodways and food sideways. I don't really study domestication. I don't really study food production per se. I actually study the technological use of plants. And so I end up kind of poking my colleagues a little bit about food, and I'm going to do so again this evening. So I have interests in sort of larger scale questions about how people are managing landscapes, managing plant communities for plant production, for economically useful plants. So not just foods, but also fibers and perhaps some other things. And one of the things I want to point out about this garden is that there are no guesses here. This garden is grounded solely in the archaeological record. Everything we have planted in it, we know are what people are using. And in fact, this wild fruits profile is basically the wild fruits profile from float samples from Mound D at Toltec Mounds. What this garden is not is a Three Sisters garden. And actually, I'm going to do an experiment, a little audience participation here. Everybody's got a smartphone. I want you to pull out your smartphones, if you've got some internet access, and I want you to Google Native American garden. And I'm going to make a predictive statement here. The entire first page of results is going to be Three Sisters Gardens. And in fact, that's probably going to be the second page, and the third page, and the fourth page, and the fifth page, and the sixth page. And that's fine. That's not a wrong idea. By AD 900, people in the Southeast and the Midwest are in fact growing roughly that profile. But it's not all they're growing. They're also growing amaranth, and they're growing tobacco, and they're probably still growing chenopodium as well. So we have an issue here with our kind of popular notions of what quote-unquote native plant use is all about. And this Three Sisters one is really kind of the sticker in many ways for me. We ask kids who come to the park, what did Native Americans eat? And they'll always say corn, beans, and squash. They're not wrong, but they are wrong for the time period that we're talking about at our site. These folks were not growing corn. They definitively did not have beans. And the squash that they had been domesticated in the Southeast locally by their ancestors. A little dig at corn there. One of the things that's real important about how this garden is set up and why it has this sort of mix of plants is, as I was saying, I have this real interest in sort of larger scale questions about plant management, about landscape management, and also about plant communities and human-plant community relationships. The model for this garden is what we would think of more as sort of a forest garden, or in some ways a midden garden. And in fact, we brought in 2.5 tons of organic commercial midden, otherwise known as compost, and laid it out in the garden. So the garden started off from day one as a midden garden. It has a nice enriched base from which it's growing. And we're doing a couple of things to that as we go. But we're also intercropping. We're intermixing these plants together. We're growing quote-unquote wild fruits as well as these wild progenitors for our Eastern North American domesticates. And we're growing plants that were not food at all, but used for fiber, like the Eryngium yucifolium. If anybody wants to ask me about that, go for it. One of the reasons why I'm doing this is not only is it a very interesting model to think about, and it's also a very different model than what people mostly think about in terms of popular culture about Native American gardens. So that Three Sisters Gardens gives you this, it's not really monoculture, but it's just a very simple form of agriculture. You've got your rows of corn, and you plant your beans next to the corn, and they grow up the corn, and you plant your squashes in between, and they grow between, okay? What we are probably looking at, even during that time period, but definitely during earlier time periods, are very big, landscape scale, complex systems of management of plants, management of resources. And so bringing these plants together and trying to understand, how do you grow food and fiber in the same place? How do you get the needs for fruits versus the need for food? We have some really fascinating examples of why this is an issue in the archaeology of the Southeast United States. So the Ozark Plateau, we have a remarkable number of extremely dry caves and rock shelters. Sadly, most of them now have either been developed out of existence or have been looted out of existence. But we get these really nicely well-preserved assemblages that were collected during the 1930s and 1940s. And in doing the analysis that I was doing for plant use for technology, I was doing a lot of fiber identification for textiles from the Ozark Plateau. I still don't need the internet. And one of the things I came across was the fact that people up in the Ozark Plateau were using maygrass as a textile source. Previously, all of the literature, including earlier analysis of the materials from the Ozark Plateau, were looking at maygrass as a part of this crop profile. It's a part of this food production. And we get these really, they're very pretty, they're actually more impressive in person, but we get these big bundled sheaves of maygrass culms that come out of the bluff shelters. It's like somebody had swooped up the grass, cut it a certain length, and then tied it up and deposited in the rock shelter. Well, first of all, that's a pretty silly way to store your seed. Seed heads are probably just going to sort of trickle right off the top of that seed head there and end up all over the floor of the bluff shelter. But more importantly, we're definitively seeing the whole culm, including the seed head, woven into textiles. And so we have this great example of a big, it's about yay big around, and it's pretty thick. It's almost like this thick. It gets described in the original documentation as a shoe. It's not a shoe. It's probably a pad that's either somebody's using it to sit on in a rocky bluff shelter, or they're using it probably more likely they're using it as a burden basket pad, because we do have burden baskets. So it's what they're using to keep that basket from rubbing against their back as they're carrying it. So it raises this interesting question about how do you plan and how do you manage and what are you doing if you have a plant that you're using for more than one purpose? The other example that we have from the Ozark Plateau and most of the rest of the Midwest and Southeast is pawpaw. We know that people are eating the pawpaw fruits archaeologically, but we also know for a fact that they're weaving with it and they're making beautiful textiles out of pawpaw fiber. One of the other things this garden has to do with sort of experimental ancient agroecology. As I mentioned earlier, I have this interest in how are we going to manage these plants together. But there's also some things about plants that are real interesting. And Natalie sort of talked about it some in terms of its plant plasticity. The fact that plants, if you take them and move them and put them in other places, or you start to muck around with them, can do some very interesting things. And we don't know enough about how these crops were interacting with each other and how people were managing them and gardening them. So we have unplanned variables in what we're doing. I have discovered, much to my amazement, I'm probably now like Spider-Man, basically. I probably have enormous amounts of spider venom running through my veins. I pretty much spend every summer tracking my spider bite, just to make sure I don't have to go to the emergency room. Various spider bites. Turns out the sumpweed, the Marshelder, is the favorite place for all of the spiders. making it even more interesting, aside from the contact dermatitis that it gives you when you brush up against it. But other things, and this also raises questions like, why were people domesticating this plant? It's not a nice plant. But we also have to deal with things like drought and flooding. This is the flooding that wiped out our erect knotweed and almost took out all of my squash seedlings. And we also have issues of predation, which I'll raise as well. But we're also doing some things to sort of track what happens when we treat these plant communities in different ways, and also paying very close attention to sort of how plants are interacting with each other, because plants don't just sort of exist in a vacuum, they exist in communities. And what we're doing in a garden like the Plum Bayou Garden is bringing together plants that normally exist in slightly different plant communities and putting them all together. And so it's important to understand how they're going to react to each other, basically who plays well with who. So one of the first things that we learned is that Iva doesn't play well with anybody, and little barley tries to. So what we're seeing in the Plum Bayou Garden is that the little barley and the cucurbits, the squashes, make for very good companion plants. Because by the time the squashes are getting big, the little barley has gone through its flowering and fruiting stage and is dying out completely. And so you can see here on the upper right-hand side, you've got some really nice squashes coming into maturity there, and all that brown grass is the little barley dying back. So they balance each other nicely in terms of their timing through the season. The Iva, on the other hand, can be extraordinarily aggressive and will grow so fast that it shades out the little barley and starts to kill it and basically everything else around it. Which brings us to the Iva itself. I made a monster in my garden, and I really didn't intend to. What you see in the upper right-hand side is the parent population for the Iva annua. It is an annual plant, so it has to come back from seed every year. So this is actually year 3 of the parent population in this photograph. And that's about as tall as it gets. It gets a little bit over 5 feet tall, and it is in prime condition for sumpweed. It's in a low, wet spot. It gets full sun. We don't brush hog it. It's just in a wonderful spot for it in its natural environment. And that is my year 1 Iva in the garden with me barely peeking out over the top of it, and it's not done yet in this photograph. Year 1, the Iva achieved heights of over 7 feet tall. It got to 6 feet, collapsed, and kept growing. It just went a little out of control. So much so that it produced so much vegetation that we decided at the end of year 1 to go ahead and institute a system of slash and burn. So we cut down all of the dead vegetation in November, put it up into big piles, all the dead squash vegetation, all the dead Iva, big piles, and burned it. I had a great team of college students as well as some tribal members there to do a slash and burn. But as you can see, the Iva reseeded like mad. So the photograph in the upper left-hand side is basically the Iva seedlings in, might I add, January of 2016. So yeah, we're in the South. It doesn't get quite so cold down there, but still, that's a little outrageous. It's January. What are you doing? I had to go out of the country. By the time I got back, it was insane. We literally spent from April to August fighting back the sumpweed in the Plum Bayou Garden. It took us months to get it weeded back and away from everything else. It was just out to kill everything. This year, what ended up happening is that I decided not to do a slash and burn in the fall. I wanted to see what would happen if I left it standing all winter long. So this year, we just left it out in the garden. We never cut it down or anything. I did a harvest, but we left the dead plant standing, and we haven't done a burn. And it turns out at this point that we're too late to do a burn, so we won't be doing one at all. But this is what happened. So this is February of this year, and I don't have anywhere near the germination rate for the Iva that I did when I did a slash and burn. We're still not entirely sure what's going on here, but of course this is part of the whole point of doing these kinds of experimental agroecology, to understand how these plants behave when you treat them under sort of different regimes. One of the things that I've always found very interesting is that there's a kind of an implicit assumption, and sometimes it's explicitly said, that the major method by which people are managing landscape in the southeast United States during prehistory is with fire. Fire, fire, fire. You read it in a lot of ecology papers, you read it in a lot of botany papers, you read it even in a lot of archaeology literature as well. I think there might be some issues with that. First of all, I'm not sure people were real keen to set fire to landscapes around their houses. I wouldn't be. But also, as what I'm seeing in the Plum Bayou garden is that sometimes fire can backfire on you. So when we did a slash and burn where we massively disturbed the Iva and did this little burn, I ended up with this outrageous germination. That might have been to a benefit, but in my case, it was actually a bit of an issue. It was going to kill every other crop I had in the garden. That's not going to work out so well if you're multi-cropping. And one of the interesting things that we see is that we know from ecological studies that little barley and maygrass are very sensitive to fire. They're not fire resistant, and fires will kill them back. So when I did do the burn, I inhibited the growth of the little barley. So this year we have less of the Iva, but the little barley is going gangbusters. Something else happened to the Iva too that I'm still sort of trying to figure out, and I gave all these guys seeds, like, please help. I sort of inadvertently increased seed size. It wasn't something that we expected to see happen. It's certainly not something we expected to see happen quickly. And I'm not entirely sure at this point whether we're just seeing sort of a blip in terms of a plant that's had a chance to have a really rich environment, or if this is something that is actually changing rather rapidly in the wild Iva. But it's not wild any longer. This is now a cultivated plant. It's been put into a garden, it's tended, it's cared for, it's weeded. So this is cultivation. So we're seeing Iva seeds that are 5 millimeters and in some pretty significant numbers. I'm still trying to sort of crunch those numbers too. But I've got a photograph here that gives you a good idea of that when we're talking about the increase of seed size in domesticated plants in the pre-Columbian period. On the left, the black colored seed, that's the wild, that very small black seed. And then on the right, that's the dry desiccated seed from Eden's Bluff in Arkansas. And you can see it's nearly 3 times the size, and it's changed color. So this year, we're in the baby data stage. We've got some little seedlings. We won't be doing a burn, but once again, we'll be doing sort of some testing to see what kind of seed yields we get, what kind of seed sizes we get, and what kind of germination rate we get in the garden this year. One of the other things I want to really quickly mention is that something very interesting has also happened. Toltec Mounds is sadly, it's a beautiful state park, but it's sort of a refugium in the middle of what is basically an extraordinarily devastated agro-industry landscape. Most of the fields around us have been zero leveled for rice. Unfortunately, in Arkansas, it's legal to use an herbicide called Command, which kills everything. And it's interesting because Command is not allowed. It's not legal to use it in most of the rest of the US, but for reasons I don't really want to get into here, in Arkansas you can. It's quite devastating. And so there is something happening in our garden that we didn't quite expect to see, and we certainly didn't expect to see it happen so rapidly, and that's the increase in biodiversity. You know, obviously I'm working with some different parameters here because I'm on a modern landscape, but I do want to point out that one of the things we're seeing from long-term studies and research in places like the Maya region, we're beginning to understand that things like Maya forest gardening actually increase rainforest biodiversity. So people farming in the jungle is not decreasing biodiversity, it's increasing it. Because people are creating these mosaic landscapes where you get different succession of plants, and they're very carefully manipulating and harvesting and maintaining across a large-scale landscape. So there is a real potential for these kinds of systems of management to actually increase biodiversity, and it's certainly something that we're seeing at our Plum Bayou garden. We have now two very interesting and very beautiful butterfly species. So we've got the monarchs. We got the monarchs immediately with the milkweed, and it took a year and a half. But we now also have something like Gulf Coast frilly. Both of these are species that are dependent. So the monarchs on the milkweed and the Gulf Coast is dependent on passion flower, the maypops. We also have much, much, much more in terms of literally the birds and the bees going on out there. There's a lot more native pollinators. If anyone wants to ask me later what it's like to get mugged by an owl, I'd be happy to tell you. And this is my buddy. This is Dino. He grew up in the garden last year. He's a little mockingbird. And I actually know it's him because I taught him how to call the dog. So if I make the little call, like when you whistle for a dog, he'll respond. I want to really quickly, if I'm okay on time, and if it'll do it, give you a sense of what it's like to stand in this garden with our birds and our bees. So I'm in all of our perennial fiber plants right now. What I want to point out, I dragged the park interpreters out with me because I was pretty happy to see all of the insect activities. So we started doing a little bit of, and they've got some, training in how to do these sorts of things as park staff. So we did a little bit of, they're like flash biodiversity counts, where you basically take like a square foot area and you try to like quickly count all of your different species. When I was out there initially filming this, I thought maybe that what we were mostly seeing were commercial honeybees. And it turns out that they're only like 1 in 15 of our insects. The vast majority of the native pollinators you're seeing flying around right now are actually all wasps. These are about 8 different wasp species that are critical to pollination of native plants. And the red-winged blackbirds. One of the other things I also discovered, and this isn't quite so happy, is that we also get some issues with insect predation on our crop species. So this is a rather devastating loss of squash that occurred in the span of 10 days. We got an infestation of Anonis tristis. I'm not a big insect person, but that's squash bug. And I had to look them up, and it turns out that they themselves are actually native to the southeast United States, or to the eastern United States. So this is a vegetable predator that people would have had to have dealt with during the woodland and the Mississippian and even the Archaic period as well. So that raises some questions about what are people doing for insect management, for pest management. We've got some things in our garden too that are great, big, enormous unknowns. Well, actually, we don't have them in the garden. I have rye. I have wild native rye in the garden, and they're there as part of what's going to be a potential project coming down the line, hopefully, to try and figure out what this thing is. We have something at our Plum Bayou sites in the central Arkansas River Valley that we call type X grass. It is an unknown domesticated grass species. Excuse me. We know with certainty that it is not a European sort of contaminant in the archaeological record because we do have direct dates on some of these grains and they come in at AD 700. So it's definitively a New World, an Arkansas River Valley domesticate. There are also some questions about how far and wide it's spread. It's mostly associated with our Plum Bayou sites in the Arkansas River Valley, but we do see it coming out of Couple Mound and Spiro, Oklahoma in small numbers, and also from a mound in Tennessee just across the Mississippi River from the Arkansas River. So this is a rather interesting project that we might be trying to sort of pick up and look at. There's a possibility that this actually might be some sort of hybrid between our little barley and our native wild rye. And originally I thought that that was just not even remotely possible because little barley flowers so early. And as a matter of fact, it germinates in December and it grows all through the winter. So when you're out there right now during the wintertime, the only green thing in the garden is the little barley. It's this beautiful, lush little green carpet out there. And then it flowers real super early. Basically by the end of May, it's roughly done. And by the beginning of June, it is definitively done. In the meantime, the wild rye don't really start flowering until roughly sort of middle to early summer. So they don't really have any overlap that would allow there to be any kind of hybridization, I thought. Except in the Plum Bayou garden, which is apparently the garden of all things that happen weird, this year the little barley went 2 and even 3 rounds. So it flowered in April, and it set seed, and it released seed, and then it decided, what the hell, this is doing great, I'll go again. And it flowered, and it set seed, and it released seed, and it was still flowering and seeding by the time the rye started to flower. So there are potentials that what happens with some of these plant species, when you take them out of their native environments and put them into cultivated situations, they begin doing things very strange and very unusual. And that's pretty much that. I'm easy to find. You can find the Plum Bayou Garden online. We talk about it quite a bit on our Facebook page, and we also have a link for it for the Arkansas Archaeological Survey. We have a bit of a page up on there, and there should be some updates on the garden up there soon. So thank you.
Natalie, Andrew, come join us on the stage. At this time, there are 2 microphones out here. If folks have any questions for any of the speakers tonight, I invite you to ask them. Yes. I invite you to ask questions that you may have, and we're all willing and able to answer those as necessary. Any questions? No questions?
Is it on?
No,
for a
you.
super tall person too. Do I turn it on?
There we go.
But I don't know how to turn it. Is it on? Oh, it's right there. Oh my God. Hello. It's really tall. I know. I'm just going to leave it because I know Elliot's going next. Okay, so my question is for Liz. I'm wondering, with your type X Poaceae, have you guys done any sort of genetic testing to see if there's crossover hybridization? I don't know if everybody could hear that.
That would be an amazing thing to be able to do, but unlike every other domesticated crop in eastern North America, this is the only species that we do not have in any of our dry contexts. So the only thing we've ever had are carbonized. And once there are little chunks of carbon, there's no DNA to go after. That upsets me. Yeah.
I have a question. In a lot of these domestic sites that we dig in the middle woodland, they always seem to be burned. And in the middle woodland, from the Patton bog data, there's a lot of charcoal in the middle woodland. I don't know what the answer is, but I'll ask you, mostly Liz, but anybody. Could they be, when they leave their hamlet, the 2 to 3 houses, and they move to another one, not that far away, could they be burning down the hamlets and turning them into gardens? Because there's a lot of human waste, of course, because kids will do that. And there's a lot of compost stuff, and then you got all the wood and the...
Yeah, and they would make for ready cleared spaces as well.
Right,
You wouldn't have to be investing a whole lot of time in clearing. So that is a very real possibility. One of the things that's frustrating for us is that it's very, very hard for us to get good archaeological data on where people have their gardens and their fields. So that's an aspect of the archaeological record that's very, very hard to go after. It's a good possibility, certainly.
think that mosaic idea is great. You know, the pole stuff on the ridgetop, which nobody, I don't think, I know there's one article on somebody on the slopes, south-facing slopes, but the idea of hedging your bets, you know, which you mentioned, that makes a perfect sense. You know, it's a very complex, and also the forest management as well would fit right into that all. So it's,
And that also happened historically. So the people who, Native Americans at the time of contact with Europeans were doing that exact thing, at least in Western New York, where I'm from. The old village sites were always gardens. And they were gardens at first, and then they were really good sort of brushy environments for hunting. So they had a use life for 100 years after they were abandoned.
It actually is on. I did tap it. I made myself look like an idiot by like, ding, 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 ding. Oh, it's on. I just want to really quickly add, you know, one of the, I'm sure these guys have looked at some of this literature as well, but some of the models that I look at to try to understand some of this stuff are actually agricultural cycles in Thailand called Tulankaban, if I get that right. But it's very clear, and also this is true also for milpa systems in Mexico and the Maya forest gardens, that when people are doing this kind of shifting swidden agriculture, those fallow fields are never actually abandoned. They're never abandoning anything. They're constantly going back and reusing these spaces, but for slightly different purposes. So you get good hunting spaces, you get spaces with lots of sort of, you know, forbs and herbs and medicinals and fibers and architectural materials. These are not just sort of like, people just walk away from them.
Yes, my question is for Natalie Mueller. You mentioned that erect knotweed used to be common in cities and towns. How did you get evidence to show that that was the case?
Well, I'm really lucky in St. Louis because we are home to either the first or second largest herbarium in the world at the Missouri Botanical Garden. And so they have records on, especially good records on native North American plants going back hundreds of years. They actually have specimens that were collected by Linnaeus. They have specimens that were collected by Darwin. And they have lots and lots from the eastern U.S. in the late 1700s and early 1800s, and then throughout the 19th century. And so most of the specimens that I looked at from right up until the early 20th century came from these towns and cities. But of course, in the Midwest, those were frontier towns that had just been built at that point. And so I think as our way of life gradually, had more time to sort of have its effects on the plant communities, you see this Eurasian prostrate erect knotweed doing a lot better. And I think the number one reason why is because of mowing. Mowing completely changes the selective pressures that act on annual plants, and plants that can tolerate it do really, really well, and plants that can't just can't compete anymore.
And that shift would have happened in the last 100 or 200 years?
Yeah, and probably really more recently than that. I mean, I was still finding specimens from like the 50s and 60s that were in cities, so, yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
We have a great example of that Toltec mounds. If anybody's familiar with what New England aster looks like, it's usually a great, big, huge, beautiful, bright blue flowering bush, but they mow the mound areas, so it looks like a golf course. So we have a New England aster that blooms in the summertime at Toltec Mounds. It's this high.
Yeah. Life finds a way.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, you've talked a lot about the cultivation of these plants. You haven't really talked about preparing them or eating them. What do they taste like? Have you done it? What did they do with them? Are they, gruels, pemmicans? I mean, how do they use these plants that were apparently so much of an important part of their diet?
So I think we'll probably all have something to say about this, right?
Yeah, it's like do this by species. Like, well, you talk about chemotherapy.
Yeah. Yeah, so the short answer in terms of erect knotweed is that I haven't had, like all good farmers, I have to maintain seed security. And until this year, I haven't had enough seed to eat it. I had to save it all to plant the next year. So I've, occasionally chewed on a seed or something just out of curiosity. But they have Polygonum erectum seeds have a very slight peppery flavor, which I think is probably one of the reasons why this species was cultivated, because that was a taste that was lacking in Eastern cuisine, anything spicy. So I think taste obviously had something to do with why people were cultivating erect knotweed. In terms of processing it, you may have seen somebody had one of Chris Gremillon's data tables from one of her studies up there at some point, where she had statistics on how much energy it would take to process each of these different plants. And her source for the polygonum was this little tiny study that was done by this professor and his students in the 1980s, where they tried pounding different species of knotweed, and they found that it was like really, really difficult to process it and had extremely high processing costs. And I think, I haven't done it yet, but I think that is right, that data is correct. But there are other ways of processing this plant. I think that people were not doing it that way because it's really hard. So one thing that I have from the archaeological record, which there was a picture of in my presentation really briefly, are contexts, a couple different contexts where the fruits have actually started to sprout. So they're preserved sprouts. They're so cute in the archaeological record. And so like when I found these, I got really excited and started reading all this stuff about sprouts, and you know, they're super healthy for you for a lot of different reasons. They're a lot easier to digest than seeds because a lot of the sugars have been transformed in ways that make them easier for humans to digest. And buckwheat, there's a lot of really good data on buckwheat sprouts because a lot of people eat them. They've got something like 3 times the nutritive value for humans that buckwheat seeds do before they've sprouted. So one completely labor-free way that they may have been processing erect knotweed seeds is by just letting them sprout and then eating them once they'd sprouted. Another thing that they may have been doing is like toasting, popping them basically, because the the pericarp fractures at really low temperatures, which is part of the reason why we hardly ever get big assemblages where we have good preservation of the whole fruit, unfortunately for me. But it probably was good for ancient cooks, because if you just kind of toast them, I'm acting like I have a frying pan, I don't know, in a basket, I guess. Then they're popped and you can eat them the way that you would eat like kashi buckwheat porridge or something like that. Do you want to go next?
Well, I'll just real quickly say, we do have big, flat coil baskets from the Ozark Plateau, and actually the largest of them is, it's huge. There's these great big, enormous coil baskets. And when I was doing the analysis of these coil baskets, a real high percentage of them actually have charring on the interior surface, which means that what they're doing is they're filling this nice big flat basket that has a very slight rise at the edge with probably some seed materials like polygonum or goosefoot or maybe the stinky iva, and then they're putting in hot embers and they're shake toasting, they're popcorning, whatever it is.
So another cool thing that I found from the context of erect knotweed is a lot of times where I'm finding it are in these things that we call earth ovens. They're like limestone lined pits where people were steaming, at least in Illinois, we think they were usually used for steaming fish because we'll find a lot of fish bone in them. But I also find polygonum in that context a lot. And so I've been kind of imagining this like steamed fish and knotweed dish that could be really tasty.
I do think we need to give native chefs a little bit more credit for creativity, because oftentimes our default, I did this in my talk, our default is saying, oh, they made it into a porridge because processing it's too difficult. And that could have been the case oftentimes. But I think that there's a lot more creativity that could have been taking place, especially in earth oven cooking, like you were saying. We find, I just found some little barley in the bottom of an earth oven. That probably wasn't there just necessarily for its seed alone, but it may have also been there for, people often lined earth ovens of things they were roasting, such as tubers or meats, with grasses, as you were saying. They could have done with erect knotweed as well. But a lot of our ethno-historical record shows that people were using grass for that. But things could have served multiple purposes, and you could have had the seeds from that as well.
So Chenopodium berlandieri is pretty easy. It tastes like quinoa in most cases, but it also it depends on how you clean it. So like quinoa, you get it in a little bag where it says rinse thoroughly before consuming, right? It's because it's got those saponins on the exterior if it hasn't been pre-washed. The same thing with our native species, though it seems like there's a little bit more of those saponins. So it's got a bitter flavor to it unless you wash it off. Those chemicals are water soluble. So we've done it in a couple different ways. So to speed up processing, we threw some in a coffee grinder. It makes it easy. You give it a little bit, a low setting on the coffee grinder. It takes the seed coats off. You blow those out of it. You throw it back in the coffee grinder, and you turn it into a flour. And we've done tortillas with it. We kind of made these little cakes. They're like, we added egg to it. They're like pancakes, I guess. Yeah, they're quinoa pod pancakes, and they're really tasty. Depending, again, on how much you've rinsed them, you get some that are a little more bitter, some that, at one point I started adding a little bit of syrup to it and made it sweeter, and yeah, it was essentially pancakes, but the kind that are much healthier for you than like what Aunt Jemima or Bisquick or whatever types.
We should also point out that with the goosefoot, it's also an edible green, and it's a fabulous green, and it was probably a part of a sort of a suite of greens that people were eating in the spring. We know from ethnographic and ethnohistoric records that the native peoples of the Southeast and Midwest were going out and harvesting and collecting all these sort of early spring greens. And in fact, today, the big thing in the early spring for Cherokee communities is actually the ramps. But it's not, everybody knows about the ramps, but the thing that accompanies that is actually also a rudbeckia, the cutleaf green coneflower, or kochani, that they're going out and collecting the greens from. And so the goosefoot is probably a part of a suite of greens that were being eaten. So it's probably being eaten a couple different ways.
Yeah, it's nice because you got to thin out.
You got to thin it out anyway, right?
Right.
Yeah. I will say about the Iva, the slumpweed, this is, I think, Andrew's experience as well. This plant kind of mystifies me a little bit. It has an extremely strong odor. It has this very strong herbal odor. It smells like Artemisia, I think.
Yeah, it smells pretty medicinal.
Yeah, it's very medicinal smelling. As a member of the Asteraceae family, it produces huge amounts of pollen in the summertime when it's going full force. It's gotten to the point in the last year that I'm basically the only person that can go out and work in the garden for prolonged periods in the summertime because I don't have allergy issues. But a lot of my student volunteers were like, we're tapping out. The Claritin ain't cutting it with the Iva. And it's, for both of us, the experience of cooking it is that it smells awful. It just smells, I don't know if I had rancid seed or I'm an idiot, which was, a real possibility. I'm not actually somebody who spent, the descendant of 5,000 years of this type of plant use, but it was nasty. So I don't really fully understand.
Help. We're crowdsourcing.
Yes. Not to make this plant sound really appealing and to be able to cook it.
My question is for Paul. Let's say the experimental plots go well, things continue to go well. What are the other hurdles that you have to overcome to get, let's say, large-scale cultivation in this region in terms of the science, maybe the finance behind it, or some policy hurdles even within Ohio? I don't really know a whole lot about it, but just kind of curious what it takes to get a crop in big rotation in the region.
Well, my framework where I'm coming from and thinking about it is, one, I'd like to, and we've all kind of exchanged seeds and things, but I'd like to produce some other varieties that are better adapted towards different circumstances, right? As we probably would have seen in prehistory. So instead of this one big, here's the variety we're growing, we definitely want to keep that diversification going. But I think some of the hurdles that we have going forward is probably the equipment. These seeds currently, and particularly with our local varieties, and we're doing some open pollination with a Mexican cultivar of the same species that has been cultivated probably for the last couple thousand years in one form or another that has thinner testes. So we're trying some open pollinating with that to kind of speed up some of the process. But I think machinery and equipment that's really specialized towards the processing, the cleaning of this particular crop is something we're going to have. I don't see it as a hurdle. I see it as a wonderful opportunity for some of those mechanical engineers that I know who just love tinkering with stuff to come up with some new equipment. Amaranth is a really closely related seed, and I'm starting to see a lot of screens and things like that are popping up now that are specialized towards amaranth. And so it wouldn't surprise me. We just tinker with one of those a little bit, and we'll have the equipment for cleaning the quinopods. But also, I think it's the market, right? Quinoa has been in production for thousands of years, and it only in the last couple decades has really taken off as a major food. And so I think part of it is a question of marketing, and how do you market Berlandieri as being a variety of food, or the East. I don't know. I mean, I've heard people say to me, "Oh, just name it the United States or Eastern North American quinoa." But I think there's some marketing issues as well, and really trying to get production up to the level that would be ideal for taking it off in the business perspective and as an economic crop. And the other thing, I guess, that for me personally is I have no interest in doing that. I am as anti. My life will never be on that business end of things, right? I want to continue to dig in the dirt. I want to continue to do those things. So I think part of the process here is also just letting other people run with it. And there are plenty of opportunities. I mean, I will be honest. I do carry. Oftentimes in the fall, I carry little vials of seeds in my pockets, and I'll see some disturbed soils around town, and I might spread some of the quinopods in it, and think I'll come back later. I just made a little plot there, but so to get other people growing it intentionally instead of me just being a seed gorilla out there and fighting against the man, right? With monoculture But yeah, I think interest, I think marketing, and I think just a little tinkering for mechanical engineering.
My question is for Elizabeth Horton. I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the slash and burning process, and just how that affects the germination of the seeds and everything.
Okay, so that technique of agriculture is actually it's pretty old, and we see it in a multitude of places across the globe. It's not uncommon in terms of sort of small-scale agriculture. What people are doing is what we call slash and burn, or swidden agriculture. And so what they're doing is they're clearing a small area of forest or a small area of shrubby stuff. They'll pile everything up. They'll usually wait a little bit for that to dry, and then they'll just go ahead and burn the whole area. And then some peoples will till or turn up the soil a little bit and kind of move that ash down in. Others may not necessarily do that. They might just sort of plant straight into the ash layer. The understanding is that there's a couple of things that go on. So some plants will be knocked back by fire. In other words, if you get a ground fire that's hot enough, it's probably just toasting the seeds, and that's that. So they're not going to come in. And there are some weedy things too that it'll sort of knock back as well. And then the ash that you get from the burning actually is also a soil enrichment. So it's a kind of just a ready-made additive to your soil composition. But then what happens over time, generally speaking, is that your little plot just starts to get sort of weedier and weedier as you go. And it sort of gets potentially also less productive as you're going. And so you end up needing to kind of shift off to a new plot, clear another little area, and sort of start the process all over again. But this is where we anthropologists have to sort of start pushing back against what seem to be some sort of innate notions that this is sort of an anti-ecological way or that this is a wasteful way to use land. Because as I mentioned earlier, what we're beginning to see and understand is that this is actually, in some cases, as long as it doesn't reach like a huge scale where you're slashing and burning the entire rainforest, if you're creating these like mosaic landscapes, you're actually increasing biodiversity. So in terms of what we're doing in our garden, it's a little different because I have permanent interpretive panels that cost $4,000. So we're real careful about that fire. So what we're doing is we're basically piling up our dead vegetation at the end of roughly the major growing season, and then we'll go ahead and burn it in one place. And usually, I've got to have a student stand by with the hose ready. We've got to keep our fence wet. We got to keep the fire away from our perennial plants.
Would you say the slashing and burning process has like some kind of similarity to how winter affects like the process of growth, or not at all?
No, no, because in many ways, so
I just wondered if it was like, similar.
You mean aiding in germinating certain seeds, or?
Yeah.
Well, it would actually, yeah, maybe.
There are some that are really. One of the plants that was important during the same era that we're talking about is native hazelnuts.
Right,
And
which would be.
hazelnuts are a plant that's like that. Like they'll, I think they can germinate if they're not burned, but they definitely are like a plant that aggressively colonizes burned over areas because it causes their seeds to like all germinate at once.
The thing that I find really interesting about this use of fire, and I sort of mentioned it, but this use of fire is that when we're looking at that EAC complex, the little barley, the maygrass, the sunflowers, the iva, the polygonum, those are plants that have very different reactions to fire regime. So the maygrass and the little barley would get knocked down. They'd be gone. If you were burning in the late fall, where your little barley had seeded, you're done with. It's not coming back. But I don't know. What's
I don't know about polygonum at all. I've never tried burning. My gut feeling is that it probably doesn't like getting burned since it grows on creek banks. It's not an area that usually gets burned, but I could be wrong about that.
Thank you.
Kind of build on his question, I kind of want to know if some other methods you use to manage the garden other than slash and burn, and are you using modern tools, prehistoric tools? And the second part of my question is, have you compared the yields from your garden to wild yields from some of these plants?
Yeah, okay, so I'm starting the start of the third full year of the garden. And so the first year that we had the garden, I actually it's a $10,000 grant. If the plants did not live, I was done. This was not going to be good. So the focus was really on making sure that the garden actually established itself and got going. So we actually really have only had 2 years now of any kind of mucking about with what we're doing. We use no modern tools in the garden, not in terms of like mechanized tools. We use no mechanized tools. I do occasionally use a metal hoe if I need to kind of like chop at the edges and make sure I sort of knock back weeds. The vast majority of the weeding that's done in the garden is basically done by me, and it's done literally with my hands. I just go out, I smoke. So if I'm needing to get away from my computer, I walk out to the garden and I have a cigarette and I fold the joints. Walk away. That's what I do every day. I have an assistant who's going to help me do that too, because she likes to be out there as well. So we're doing a lot of it just literally by hand. We haven't done experiments with sort of prehistoric style tools. But one of the things I'll point out to all of the students in the audience here is that this garden is an open research garden. It's not just for my research. It is open to research proposals from students anywhere in the United States who'd like to come and do a project there. So you want to come do an experiment on different methods of tool use, it's It is a research garden. I mean, obviously, mostly I'm probably going to have Arkansas students coming, but I do want people to understand that this is an open research garden. And we're also a living seed bank. We had to hold off the first year, but as Natalie pointed out, we're now, as long as you're a researcher or a nonprofit institution, you can get seed from me for any of these species. And then
The wild yield.
yeah, so we haven't had a chance to do real controlled yield experiments yet. But with the IVA in particular, because our parent population is on site, it's just across the site, that is what that's coming up. We'll be looking at yield differences between them.
And the yield differences for polygonum are huge. I mean, like
Yeah.
10 times or more. If you harvest seeds from a wild plant, the plants are like, the biggest wild plants I've seen are like maybe this tall, and they've got like a few branches, and so you'll get like a little handful of seed. But my plants that I harvested from my garden this year, some of them had like a liter of seeds on one plant, so it makes a huge difference.
Thank you.
We are post 9 o'clock now, I think. So we're going to wrap up. I want to thank everyone for coming out. Again, we want to thank Food Studies, Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and the Sugar Bush Foundation for supporting this event. I'd like to thank all of our speakers tonight. And if you are interested and would like to carry on with questions or conversation with any of the speakers, we're going to go have a short happy hour down at the West End Cider House following this. Give us like 15 minutes. But so feel free to come join us down there and carry on the conversation about crops and seeds and weeds and all of that good stuff. Thank you so much.